It's going to be a little bit different. I thought I would make some recommendations that I think are good libertarian movies. Now, I've made a couple videos about good libertarian books. This one's going to be quite a bit shorter. I'm going to qualify this as any list that talks about like best movies, and even to a lesser extent, I say best books, are awfully subjective, and also they reflect a lot about the age and the type of person who's making the list. For instance, when the API maybe about 10 years ago came out with a list of the 100 best movies, and you know, 1/3 of all movies ever have been silent. 1/3 of all movies ever have been westerns. I don't know about 1/3. It might even be more, like a half of movies have been black and white, although I don't know. And so you would think that an honest listing of best movies would have ratios something like that. And a list made in 1999 or 2000 is not going to be like that. There's probably not going to be any, or maybe only one or two silent films, only a handful of black and white films. And, you know, that's totally understandable. Who has the time to go back and watch all the silent films? In fact, it's not even literally possible because many of them are literally gone, and many of the ones that aren't gone, they're not available. There's not a YouTube channel that is uploading these videos, and the stupid studios, um, even though that would make perfect sense because once they uploaded something on YouTube, it would be basically stored forever. They wouldn't be able to make money on it necessarily, although they do sell ads on YouTube. And so they are reluctant to release anything. It's very odd when people have copyrighted material that they're not willing to go to the expense to release, yet at the same time they won't release for free. I just think that's very silly. But anyway, there can't really be any expectation that anybody has watched every film. You can't even watch every film that's coming out now, really. Some of the reviewers, I guess, probably do a pretty good job, but and so this is not a conclusive list, and I don't think that there are any movies that are explicitly made by libertarians uh, to I don't know what the word promote libertarianism is, but there are certain there are certain libertarian themes that are fairly widespread within the greater society, and any movie that emphasizes those traits is likely to have a pretty libertarian bent. So these are, and then the other thing is, you know, if I'm making a list on libertarian movies, it's very likely that I'm going to make a list of movies that I like, not necessarily ones that are. I mean, I'm trying to make it libertarian, but I mean, you just have to recognize that there's a whole lot of bias here and a whole lot of subjectivity. So, but it's just for fun, so I guess it's all right. The first ones I actually want to do are not mainstream big films. They're more like documentaries. So I don't think these are movies that were ever widely released, but I recommend them just because I think they're informative. Here's this one, In Search of the Second Amendment. You don't have to buy this. This is on YouTube now. It wasn't for many years, and so I bought it. This is a documentary about the legal tradition leading to the Second Amendment, and it's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's basically got all the main pro-gun people in it, and also it takes the civil rights angle. The gun control is racist, and many African American organizations, especially over the years, have fought against gun control. So this is a good movie. If you try and search it on YouTube, I don't know if it's up now, but it was for quite a while, so you might be able to find it. It's worth watching. This is one I'd seen a commercial for, and I went and bought. Looks like it got quite a few awards. I believe this film was actually made in one of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. The Soviet Story. This is not a comprehensive listing of why the Soviet Union is bad. That would obviously require more than a DVD. But what it does do is it compares and juxtaposes the USSR with Nazi Germany. I think the filmmakers are very adroit here because Nazi Germany is universally reviled, and rightfully so. And the Soviet Union, although it doesn't really have a good rap, is not held in the same degree of contempt, and it's even considered acceptable to talk about it, especially in Europe. In fact, I just read the other day about some politician in France had a statue of Mao erected, and that's just, I mean, that really is, if anything, it's worse than erecting a statue of Hitler. And so this documentary goes and explains, um, not every detail is related to this, but it goes and shows to what extent that they were similar. They were socialist, and they talk about socialists in the West, Western democratic socialists, and uh, how many of their views are like identical to or nearly identical to those of Hitler. Um, there's a famous video of George Bernard Shaw in here, who is just an acclaimed socialist, a famous playwright. And I mean, it's literally video of him saying that the state should kill people who cannot um, earn their keep, so to speak. That everyone should have the burden of proof. Everyone should appear before a board and justify why they should exist. And if they can't, they should humanely be put to death. And he even makes a call, quote, to the chemists to find a humane gas to liquidate people. And this is in like the 30s. So, very chilling story. He also talks, they have some scholars talk about Marx being racist, uh, talking about racial trash, basically non-WASPs, non-Northern European rich people. So the Bretons, Yugoslavians, Czechs, Poles, Russians, ironically. So this is good. I don't think you can watch this all on YouTube. I have not checked in a long time, so you can do it. The previews are on YouTube. That's the basis on which I bought it. But it's pretty good in this disgusting kind of way. These are more fun. You know, I don't do drugs at all, which I think inhibits how much fun I could have. But this is very much a good series in terms of the war on drugs. Barry Cooper. I've heard about Barry Cooper on Free Talk Live. They reference him quite a bit. He's a former law enforcement officer who specialized in narcotics. He actually got a start as a dog trainer. He was not in law enforcement, but he trained dogs. And this, I mean, the most money you're going to make in that eventually is going to be by training drug dogs for narcotics interdiction, which he started to do. And of course, he started, you know, actually using he wouldn't just give them the police dogs. He would be there, and eventually he became a cop. And these videos, one is about your home and one is about your car. Never Get Busted 1, which is called Traffic Stops. That's this one. And Never Get Raided, which is about your house. Now, this has a lot of really good information about what your rights are, but mostly it's about evasion. You know, he talks about how you shouldn't just start quoting your rights and telling you're not going to let them search your car, because then they're going to want to search your car. Now, if you don't have any drugs in your car, then you have nothing to really worry about, but or not much. But there's a really interesting part in this one, in the Traffic Stops, where he talks about how he would case out which cars to pull over. Very, very interesting information. And it was interesting because the way he did it is he got in a car and went to, you know, some local town, and he said, well, you know, this is kind of how I would pick where to stake out. And he would go and park there, and then he'd be looking at the cars, and he would be commenting as the cars go by. He goes, okay, well, that one, that's an older gentleman driving. It's a nice car. There's probably nothing. And then he see like, oh, that's a van, out-of-state plates, African-American driver, you know, and then he'd follow that. And at some point, you know, he started following a car, and he goes, at some point I'm going to decide that this car, I think, is, you know, is a good one to pull over, and then I'm just going to pull them over. I don't need a reason. I can make anything up, basically. And it was interesting because he started talking about his adrenaline getting up, that he's basically on the hunt. And I'd actually heard Ian Freeman talk about that in the show in Free Talk Live years ago. I'm almost positive he's referencing that exact thing. But it was pretty enlightening and pretty interesting. So these are good documentaries, and you'd be helping out a guy who's fighting the drug war. So, all right, that's it for like the documentaries. One movie I don't have because I really don't like it that much, enough to buy it anyway, is but it is actually a decently libertarian movie, and that's Legends of the Fall. That's the Brad Pitt movie from the early '90s, and what it is it's basically an anti-World War I and then also an anti-bootlegging, anti-corrupt police movie. I mean, they end up, the father in that is a washed-up old veteran who hates the government and who hates war. who thinks the government goes around killing Indians, which he took part in the Indian Wars. There's a famous line where he just starts saying "screw the government." But the other thing is, it's anti-World War One, and World War One is one of those things where it's like there's quite a bit of anti-World War One stuff out there. There's a lot of anti-war stuff in the context of World War One. There's a lot of people who are willing to look at the waste and destruction of World War One and say that was wanton, needless destruction. There's very few people getting up in arms about the imperial policy of Germany at the time. It wouldn't even really make sense because, yeah, Germany had imperial ambitions, and who were they fighting? The British and the French, both who had, and the Russians, all of whom had far larger, more ambitious, and ultimately more destructive and terrible empires than Germany ever attained or even was aiming to attain. Um, the only way you can really be for that war is to just say, okay, well, I'm from the United States, and the United States fought the Germans, and so, that's, I mean, not that the Germans didn't do bad things in the context of the war, but so did all the other sides. And in film, it's been done a couple times, more than a few times. I've heard about other films that I haven't seen, like Johnny Get Your Gun, All's Quiet on the Western Front, which is based on a German book. I saw the original, and then I saw part of the 1970 version, but it was pretty terrible, so I didn't really watch it. But Legends of the Fall is pretty explicitly anti-World War One, and they even have interesting dialogue there. In the book, in the movie, there's three brothers, and the youngest one gets all caught up in the idea that they got to stop the Germans, and his father and his older brothers are basically saying, why? We don't really have a dog in this fight. Maybe there are terrible things going on over there, and that's all the more reason to avoid that area. Um, and eventually, he decides to go anyway, and so his older brothers go to protect him. But it's a pretty good film. Another one that I don't own because I don't think it's particularly good, but it's also about World War One, is an early Mel Gibson film called Gallipoli. One thing I remember about that is in that movie they're from Australia, and it's about two really good friends. They call them mates. They're mates, and they are they live in this boring rural life in Australia. They hear about this big war. It sounds like pretty exciting. They want to go. And they have a father who is this very adventurous person who is always regaling them with his tales of pirates and, you know, all these amazing adventures, really rash, dangerous things that he'd done throughout his life and his youth growing up. And, at one point, they're having an argument. He's basically telling them not to go to war, and they're saying, well, you've done all these dangerous things. And he just looks at them and he goes, war is different. It's one thing if I go out and I get in a bar fight or, go on a wild expedition to Indonesia or something and get attacked by pirates. But if it's just me, I always have the option to flee, to decide that I've gone too far and I want to pull it back, and I have control over myself. Like I can decide where and what I want to do. Is in war, you're a fucking slave. You don't get to decide to run away. I mean, you could try, but then you'd be punished with death most likely. You don't get to decide how you want to attack a certain place. In World War One, you're just going to be told to jump out from behind a trench and walk across a field that's laced with barbed wire into machine gun fire. And that's fucking suicide. That's stupid. It's not bravery. That's just, well, I mean, you could be brave and do it, but I mean, it's just silly. And they end up going to war, and I don't remember all the details. I think Mel Gibson lives, but I think the ultimate thing that happens is they all die for some flippant mistake, like someone accidentally orders them to charge when they really shouldn't have, and they all die. I didn't like the film that much, but I did think that part where the father says war is different. Let's see. This one, The New World, this didn't really make a lot of waves. It's a really good movie by Terrence Malick. It's about the founding of Jamestown, and it's one of those movies that went out of its way to be historically accurate as much as possible in something like this. Everything's pretty period. I think even the language is pretty period. And one thing that I like about it is that there are a couple parts where there are monologues given, and the monologues are apparently taken from the actual writings. So John Smith will be doing a little bit of a voiceover here and there, and I think the only two who do it are Smith, Pocahontas, and John Rolfe. And Pocahontas is probably made up, but I I read somewhere that stuff Smith says is true, and he talks about that the reason, I mean, ostensibly the reason for the Virginia Company is to, you know, go and exploit resources, but what kind of the reason people realize that they're leaving their society and they're going to a completely alien place where they're going to be basically they're going to be away from the authorities in England, effectively beyond their control. And he talk about he says he wants to build a commonwealth of work, or where no one's going to be beholden to anybody, that you're not going to be a slave or a serf or a tenant, where, you know, the only thing that the only things that you have are the things that you are able to earn on your own. And it's cool, and they juxtapose it with him, you know, like exploring the river and everything. And there's a lot of violence, because there was a lot of violence, but I always liked it, and it doesn't have overt libertarian themes, but it is about like people basically trying to get free. The Native Americans are pretty freewheeling too, something that is pretty universally understood, but not often explicitly stated. There's going to be a couple Mel Gibson movies here. This is cliched, but Braveheart. It's a really good movie, but I mean, he's getting his entrails cut out and he yells freedom. So, I mean, it's pretty serious. It's about a rebellion against a government. Now, he's pro the Scottish government, which is just silly nationalism, and that's kind of out of place in this, because the nationalism, as we know, it really wasn't very well defined back then. But so it's a little bit of contemporary political ideology leaching into a historical epic, but that's all right. Oh, my phone's ringing. I'll call it. It's no big deal. So
call from toll-free call.
It's just a telemarketer. So
Call from toll-free call.
I mean, there's disrespect for the authorities here. You know, when he's supposed to get married and offer up his wife to the Lord, he decides not to do it. And when they wrong him, he doesn't say, well, they're the government, so I can't fight back. He slaughters all of them. So this is mostly just a really good movie. It's very popular. I know it's retained its popularity over the years, more so than its initial box office run would have suggested. Not that it wasn't successful, it was, but yeah, I think Mel Gibson, you know, people kind of place his political compass as conservative Catholic, and that's absolutely true. He is very, very Catholic, but he has, a lot of his movies are pretty libertarian. So this is more a good movie than a libertarian movie, but it's good. The one that is more libertarian is this, The Patriot. This also has anti-war sentiments in it that are pretty strong, and you don't hear those much in the context of the American Revolution or, say, the French and Indian War, which are the two wars that this revolves around. He's racked by guilt for atrocities he committed in the French and Indian War, even though he is revered as a hero for having committed those atrocities, but he still feels very guilty for them and unjustified in having committed them. And then he does not want to fight in the war. He's in the American Revolution. He says that we should be independent, but I'm not willing to fight myself. And he says because he has all these children, and so he's not going to have somebody else go and do it. And I mean, there's a lot in here about how terrible war is, but then there's all this stuff about freedom too. And so this is actually a pretty good movie. The Patriot. Not a surprise there. This is related, and again, this is not one that I think was intended to be libertarian, but it just covers a period where a lot of stuff was going on. That is the last of the Mohicans. There's a lot of mythology here, but it's actually relatively realistic mythology. James Fenimore Cooper, when he's writing about stuff that kind of sort of happened, and scenarios that did occur. You know, you did have military columns being wiped out by Indians. That happened more than a few times over the years, although not in exactly the place and time. This depicts that happening after the siege of Fort William Henry, and there was a massacre of sorts, although not on the scale that they depicted. But there are other times where there were massacres of that scale. But I think this is really, in a libertarian sense, this is interesting because you have the rugged individualism, the frontier ethos, but also the repudiation of the English rule over America. Uh, at one point, there's one character, I forget his name, but he's not a main character, but when they're debating whether they should fight the English, which is also interesting, there is kind of a sense that we're not obligated to fight for the government. We might do it if we think it's in our best interest, but we're not obligated to do it, which of course many of the British people reject. They say, hey, if England says you have to fight, you have to fight. But at one point, one of the characters says, okay, look, England, he says explicitly, England's still our sovereign, so the right thing to do is to help them. And then later, when they violate their agreement, basically the English promised, okay, send the militia to fight, and if there's trouble on the frontier, if Indians start raiding your homes, then the militia will be released to go and try and prevent that. And when that situation occurs, the English repudiate the agreement and say, no, you have to stay and keep fighting the French here at the fort. And he says something to the point that they set aside their law whenever it's necessary for them to do what they want, and that's a pretty good libertarian argument there. I don't think that was the intention, but it's just true that the idea that the law is not whatever the government says, and to think that it is to invite all manner of abuse. And sorry, and I know it's pretty exciting, pretty I mean, the guys running around shooting rifles, that's always a lot of fun. This movie, I think its style gets in the way of its otherwise pretty explicit anti-government message, and it's this, V for Vendetta. I was kind of turned off by this movie because the first time I watched it, it was a pirated version I downloaded, and it was pretty poor quality. And the other thing is I don't like the sound editing. I just watched it again yesterday, and like the dialogue is really quiet, and a lot of times it's not clear what they're even saying, other than like when the big dictator is on the big screen. We can hear him fine, but a lot of times when V or Evie is talking, or the detective, I can't even hear what they're saying. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. But I mean, this has explicitly anti-government, pro-liberty ideas. Now, they're not anarcho-capitalist ideas. There's kind of an implication here that, as long as you can speak out, that's good enough, and maybe if you can vote, and that's not really libertarian. But of course, they don't really explicitly say that. But it's about how the government can be tyrannical, and how that tyranny is always going to be based on some kind of necessity. They're never going to say we're being tyrannical just because we want to be. They're always going to say, well, we need to be tyrannical because of terrorism. And the enemies are terrorists, immigrants, homosexuals, and I mean, there had been a provocateur terrorist attack, a biological terrorist attack that actually was perpetrated by the government, which kind of comes out in the video. So 9/11 truthers would really appreciate this movie if they haven't already seen it already. One problem though is kind of the whole vesting everything into one guy, like this masked superhero basically, who essentially has superpowers, is the savior, and that's not a really healthy kind of way to look about the world. But it's also not the only thing that's going on. Like Evie becomes more assertive in terms of her rights, and at the end of one thing I don't like is the end is ambiguous, because it looks like the whole society kind of revolts and has a peaceful demonstration, but then they show all these characters who were shown to have been killed, and so I wonder if that was not just like wishful thinking. I don't know if anyone's seen it and has any kind of insight there. It kind of confused me, but this is not like one of my favorite films, but it does have a lot of really explicitly anti-government stuff in there, so I have to support it. Now this one I really love, and it's a bit of a surprise. Apocalypto. I should probably peel the sticker off after 5 years. This again is a Mel Gibson film, although he's not in it. Now, mostly this film is an exciting chase movie set in an unlike you know you think it's a chase movie, you think Jason Statham or something like that with cars, and this is Yucatec Maya in the early 16th century, circa 1500, 1501, something like that. And that's all true, but the other thing that it is in the center section of it is a very, very sophisticated critique, uh, not only most people would say of society, but I think specifically of the state. And what I'm talking about is it starts with the main character living in this pastoral village, very, very rural kind of primitive existence, and their village is attacked by more civilized, certainly more advanced, more hierarchical also Mayan Indians, and they're captured among in a backdrop of just incredible violence, and they're taken back to the city. And I thought it was kind of interesting that they would be that these more primitive Indians would be basically completely oblivious of this much more urban society that is apparently only 2 or 3 days away walk, which seems kind of unlikely to me, but I guess whatever. And there's just in the city is there's clearly massive social unrest, and at least some of this is probably caused by there's famine, there's blight, there's apparently been some degree of crop failures, but at the same time you see that there's all this like massive construction going on. There's all these people, and what they're depicted doing there, you see in the part of film that all these people are covered in white powder, is they're actually making plaster. They make plaster to cover the pyramids in stucco. And they've done studies, and they know how much wood it takes. You have to burn wood to create this. It's basically like a quicklime or something like that to make this plaster. It requires tons and tons and tons of lumber to be burned to produce just a relatively minor amount of this plaster. And they know how much plaster they would use to cover these, and we're talking about literally tens of thousands of hectares of forest would have to be felled to do one of these buildings. And so people are starving, the crops are failing, but they're going through all this labor basically to decorate pyramids, big what are essentially big piles of rocks. They're not defensive works, they're not roads, they're not infrastructure, they are religious temples. And when we get into it, we kind of see that when they get to the top of the pyramid where they're cutting out people's hearts and all the gory details are there, there's this subtext where you can see that people in the crowd, or at least some of the people in the crowd, are angry at the elites. There's one scene where this obviously wealthy person is being carried on a litter, and there are people just in the crowd just glaring at them. And nothing is spoken, but they explicitly show this kind of to indicate there is definitely social unrest. And the elites in this society must be thinking, okay, we have it pretty good, most of the people have it pretty shitty. What are we going to have to do? And what they do is they put on a show that is really irrelevant when it comes to running of society. And that show is they realize that there's going to be an eclipse, which is, we know, the Mayan would have had knowledge of that. Your average Mayan did not have an almanac that says there's going to be an eclipse, but the high priests, the upper echelon of society, that would have been information that they had. They would have been expecting it. And they basically put on a show in the movie where they're committing these sacrifices. The sun blacks out, which of course freaks out all the people, because most people probably had never seen that, maybe even never even heard of it. And the high priest gives a speech that says, okay, the great God has eaten the sun. Oh great God, Kukulkan, if we have been doing a good job as basically governing this society, if we've been doing a good job, give us the sun back. And the sun comes back, and everybody is completely awed by this. And he's up on top of the pyramid. There's the high priest, and there's the king behind him. And they exchange these glances, like when the eclipse happens, you kind of see them look like, hey, we were waiting for this. We needed this. Whole thing was choreographed around this. Now, this is really similar to like Pharaoh saying, well, you need the Pharaoh, otherwise the Nile won't flood or the sun won't rise. It's totally bullshit. This eclipse is going to happen whether or not they were up there sacrificing people, whether or not they even existed, it was going to happen. But there's rational ignorance. Most of the people aren't aware of that. You can't expect them to go and start their own astrological observations and figure this all out themselves. Typically, the societies that were able to predict these had like literally decades, even centuries of records, usually kept by some priestly caste, and it would not have been widely known that they were predictable. It might not have been known at all that they were predictable. I don't know the extent of the Mayans' abilities because I know the Babylonians, for instance, they know when the sun is or when the moon is going to pass between the earth and the sun, but they didn't know the sizes of the earth or the moon, and so they would know that an eclipse was going to happen, but they wouldn't know where. You know, because you can have an eclipse that only covers the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere or whatever. You have to have a knowledge of the size of the two bodies to be able to tell where the eclipse is actually going to happen. The Babylonians would know there's going to be an eclipse, but they wouldn't actually necessarily see it because it might not happen there. I don't know if the Mayans actually knew that there would be one there. I think they may have, but I don't know. But it's not important for the film. The point of the film is that this is an irrelevant showcase of the power of the elites. It's not something they actually control. It's not something they're actually. It's not a service they're actually providing, but they are through this elaborate ceremony are able to kind of give themselves credit for keeping the universe in line, more or less. You know, they bring back the sun, which is pretty impressive. And we can expect that this is going to keep their society going, or keep them in charge of their society at least for a little bit longer. But it doesn't. It's not going to end the famine. It's not going to end the blight. It's not going to end the huge waste of resources. You know, what I call a misallocation. Instead of using people's labor, people using their labor to make their own lives better, perhaps by building aqueducts or building better homes or building granaries or building more capital-intensive tools to be more efficient exploiters of the land. No, they're decorating pyramids, basically aggrandizing the ego and the political careers of the elites. Something that's not, is demonstrably not helping them. It's helping the elites, but it's not helping them, and that's part of the reason, at least, that this society is going down. Now, certainly there could be other reasons. If you have a major blight, that's not necessarily the fault of the government, or a major plague. That's also not necessarily the fault of the government, although sometimes they can exacerbate those problems. But I think this is a pretty neat example, and it's pretty subtle. There's literally no dialogue directly related to this, and the main character is basically irrelevant to this part of the plot. I mean, he's there. It's not even clear he even is catching on to any of this. In fact, he's almost certainly not, because he's probably thinking about the fact that he's about to have his heart cut out, which would probably render his observational skills pretty low. But I think it's a really great. I mean, the film is pretty cool because you have this great chase and adventure and all this cool stuff in the jungle, but then you do have actually a very sophisticated critique of civilization, and I think that was the intent, because it starts with a quote by Will Durant about how great civilizations are always destroyed from within before they're destroyed from without. And Mel Gibson actually, in interviews for the movie, compared the war with Iraq with human sacrifice, explicitly drawing a parallel, which is not a perfect one, but I think it's still apt, that it really is, where people are going to Iraq and Afghanistan to kill and to be killed, and it's no more helpful to us than armies of slaves building stucco pyramids for the king of Palenque or whatever. So it's mostly a very entertaining film, but within there is a very, very astute criticism. Most people would say of society, but I would say of the state, because this is the state that's doing all these bad things. It's not just the greater society at large or the society independent of the state. It's the state doing it. Now, I guess you can't say that states are independent of society. Clearly, they're not. But if there's an element in society that's guilty here, it is the government. And it's also interesting too, because, and I've kind of fallen into this trap too. You have the rural primitive Indians that the main protagonist is a member of, and they don't really have a state. There's no obvious chief or anybody who's in charge. They're just a society. It's basically a stateless society, and then you have this other society that's a state society, and it's more civilized, it's more technical, but it's wholly more bloodthirsty. I mean, just absolutely violent in the extreme, explicitly based on, I mean, in the case of these Mesoamerican civilizations, explicitly predicating their legitimacy on bloodlust, bloodletting. Not always human sacrifice, by the way. Usually in these societies, the king would be spilling his own blood, usually from the genitals or maybe from the ears or the fingertips, but also by human sacrifice. And there's some historical things because the scale of the human sacrifice here was probably not very common or ever happened among the Maya, although it certainly did happen among the Aztecs. So, and that would have been a contemporary Mesoamerican society. So I don't think that they should be criticized too much. He might as well just have made the movie take place in Tenochtitlan and not the Yucatan, but whatever. So anyway, that's it. That's not to say those are all the libertarian movies, and like I said, it's not to say they're super libertarian or that they're super good. Just that I think there are elements in them that are worthwhile. If anyone has any other suggestions about ones that are worth watching, I'm certainly open to that because we're always looking for good entertainment. I didn't even talk about television shows. There's a couple that I think are pretty libertarian. Firefly is one. Breaking Bad is another. Babylon 5 has its moments. Those are the three that are coming right to mind, but I'm not going to review them or anything. So, all right, that's it.